The gravel crunched under my knees as I dropped down beside her broken body. Blood matted her blonde hair to the side of her face, and her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that told me we were running out of time. I pressed my jacket against the wound on her abdomen, feeling the warmth of her blood seeping through the fabric, and that's when her eyes flickered open just enough to recognize me. "Vanessa, stay with me. The ambulance is coming. Just hold on." Her lips moved, forming words that barely had sound behind them. I leaned closer, my ear almost touching her mouth, and what she whispered made my entire world fracture into pieces I would never be able to fit back together the same way. "Nicole, it was your husband." Then her eyes closed again, and all I could do was keep pressure on the wound and scream for help into the darkness of Pinecrest Road, knowing that the man I had trusted with my life had just tried to take hers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon had started unremarkably. I remember that detail because of how quickly ordinary moments can pivot into catastrophe without any warning signs, without any chance to brace yourself for impact. I had been driving home from a late meeting at the hospital where I worked as a nurse coordinator, taking the long route through the countryside because traffic on the highway was backed up from an earlier accident. Pinecrest Road cut through farmland and scattered woods, a two-lane stretch that most people avoided after dark because there were no streetlights and cell service was unreliable at best. My headlights caught something unusual in the drainage ditch that ran parallel to the road. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe trash bags someone had illegally dumped. But something about the shape made me slow down, made me pull onto the narrow shoulder and put my hazard lights on. I grabbed my phone and the small flashlight I kept in my glove compartment, then walked back along the gravel edge, my nursing instincts already shifting into assessment mode even before my conscious mind had fully processed what I was seeing. The ditch was about 4 feet deep, overgrown with tall grass and wild blackberry bushes. The shape I had seen from the car was partially hidden by vegetation, but as I got closer and aimed my flashlight down into the darkness, I saw fabric. Blue fabric that looked like denim. Then I saw a hand, pale and motionless, fingers curled slightly as if reaching for something that wasn't there. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I scrambled down the embankment, my shoes slipping on the loose dirt and rocks, and that's when I saw her face. Even with the blood and the bruising and the unnatural angle of her body, I knew immediately. The bone structure, the particular shade of blonde hair, the small scar above her left eyebrow from when she fell off her bike when she was 7. My sister. Vanessa. The scream that came out of me was involuntary, primal, the sound of every nightmare I had ever had about losing her suddenly becoming real. I dropped to my knees beside her, my training kicking in even as my mind tried to reject what my eyes were seeing. I checked for a pulse at her neck with shaking fingers. It was there, faint and irregular, but present. She was alive. I fumbled for my phone, praying that I had enough signal out here to call for help. 1 bar. It flickered in and out, but it was enough. I dialed 911 and somehow managed to give them our location, describing the mile markers I had passed and the old red barn that was visible from the road. The dispatcher kept me on the line, asking questions about Vanessa's condition, instructing me on how to position her without causing more damage. There was so much blood. It soaked through her shirt, pooled in the grass beneath her, left dark stains on my hands as I tried to apply pressure to the worst of the wounds. Her face was swollen on one side, her lips split, her right arm bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fall or a car crash. Someone had done this to her deliberately, violently, with the intent to make sure she didn't survive. I talked to her the way I had been trained to talk to trauma patients, keeping my voice steady even though everything inside me was screaming. "You're going to be okay, Vanessa. Help is coming. I need you to stay with me. Can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." Nothing. Her hand remained limp in mine. "Come on, Nessa. You've always been tougher than me. Remember when you broke your collarbone in that soccer game and finished playing anyway? Remember when you got food poisoning in Mexico and still managed to make it to the airport? You can fight through this. Just hold on a little longer. I don't know how much time passed before I heard the sirens. It felt like hours but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. The flashing red and blue lights appeared over the hill, and then there were voices, people in uniforms moving with practiced efficiency. Paramedics slid down into the ditch with a stretcher and medical equipment, and I had to force myself to move aside and let them work even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep holding her hand, to keep her connected to this world through sheer force of will. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes and steady hands, put a hand on my shoulder. "Are you family?" "She's my sister. Vanessa Harper. She's 31 years old. No major health conditions that I know of. No allergies to medications." The information came automatically, the clinical details easier to access than the emotional weight of what was happening. "What's your name?" "Nicole. Nicole Harper. I'm a nurse at Oakmont Memorial." The paramedic nodded, processing this information. "Nicole, we're going to transport her to Oakmont. You can follow in your car or ride with us, but right now we need to stabilize her and get her out of here. Do you understand?" I understood, but understanding didn't make it easier to watch them strap my baby sister to a backboard and carry her up out of that ditch like she was already a casualty instead of a fighter who just needed more time. I climbed back up to the road, my legs shaking so badly I almost fell, and that's when I saw the police officers who had arrived with the ambulance. One of them approached me, a woman with her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and an expression that managed to be both professional and genuinely concerned. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Christine Boyd. Can you tell me what happened here?" I explained about driving home, about seeing something in the ditch, about finding Vanessa. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, disconnected and mechanical, like I was reading from a script instead of describing the worst moment of my life. Officer Boyd took notes, asked questions about whether I had seen any other vehicles on the road, whether I had touched anything besides my sister, whether Vanessa had said anything to me. That last question made me pause because I suddenly realized that in the chaos of the paramedics arriving and the rush to get Vanessa to the hospital, I hadn't registered what had happened in those few seconds before she lost consciousness again. "She did say something," I said slowly, the memory crystallizing into sharp focus. Her eyes opened for just a moment, and she whispered something to me. Officer Boyd's pen was poised above her notepad. "What did she say?" I opened my mouth to tell her, but something made me hesitate. Some instinct that I didn't fully understand yet, some part of my brain that was processing information faster than my conscious mind could keep up with. If I told the police right now that Vanessa had said it was my husband, they would go to Brandon immediately. They would question him, possibly arrest him. And if Brandon had really done this, if my husband had really tried to murder my sister, then he would know that she had survived long enough to identify him. He would know that his secret was out. "She said my name," I told Officer Boyd instead. "She said Nicole, and then she lost consciousness again." It wasn't exactly a lie. Vanessa had said my name. I was just omitting the rest of it, buying time until I could think clearly enough to figure out what to do with information that had the power to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. Officer Boyd finished her notes and handed me a card with a case number and contact information. "We'll be treating this as an assault investigation. Detective Torres will likely want to speak with you and your sister once she's stable. In the meantime, if you think of anything else or if anyone contacts you with information, please call immediately." I took the card and got back in my car, following the ambulance as it pulled away from Pinecrest Road with my sister inside. My hands were still covered in her blood. My jacket was ruined. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice was asking questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. Why would Brandon hurt Vanessa? What could possibly have motivated my husband, the man I had been married to for 6 years, the man who had always been polite and friendly to my sister, to try to kill her? And if he had really done this, how had I missed every single warning sign that should have told me I was sleeping next to someone capable of violence this brutal? The drive to Oakmont Memorial took 20 minutes, but I don't remember any of it. I must have navigated the roads and obeyed traffic signals and parked in the emergency lot, but my conscious mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying every interaction I had ever witnessed between Brandon and Vanessa, searching for clues I had missed, trying to make sense of words that made no sense at all. "It was your husband. The emergency room was organized chaos when I arrived. I identified myself as family and as a hospital employee, and they let me through to the trauma bay where a team was already working on Vanessa. I stood against the wall, staying out of the way, watching as doctors and nurses moved with choreographed precision. Someone was calling out vital signs. Someone else was establishing 4 access. A surgeon I recognized from the orthopedic department was examining her arm. Dr. Patricia Kim, the attending physician, glanced up and saw me. Her expression shifted from clinical focus to something softer. "Nicole. I didn't realize this was your sister." "I found her," I said, and my voice cracked on the words. "On Pinecrest Road. She was just lying there in the ditch." Dr. Kim said something to one of the nurses, then stepped away from the trauma bay and guided me into a small consultation room. "We're doing everything we can. She has significant internal bleeding that we need to address surgically, multiple fractures, and a head injury that we're concerned about." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next few hours are critical. Is she going to make it? Dr. Kim's hesitation told me more than her words did. "We're going to do everything possible. But Nicole, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that even if she survives, she may have sustained neurological damage. We won't know the full extent until we can get her stabilized and run more comprehensive tests." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Dr. Kim squeezed my shoulder and then went back to the trauma bay, leaving me alone in that small room with beige walls and motivational posters that suddenly seemed obscenely cheerful given what was happening just a few feet away. I pulled out my phone and stared at it, trying to decide what to do next. I needed to call my mother. I needed to call Vanessa's friends. I needed to figure out how to process what my sister had told me and what to do about it. But first, before I did anything else, I needed to call my husband and hear his voice and try to detect whether the man I married was capable of attempted murder. My finger hovered over Brandon's name in my contacts. We had been together for 8 years, married for 6 of them. We met at a charity fundraiser where his investment firm was a major sponsor and I was volunteering with the hospital foundation. He had been charming and attentive, the kind of man who remembered details from conversations and sent flowers for no particular reason. He made me laugh. He supported my career. He got along well with my family, including Vanessa, who had told me more than once that I had found a good one. Had she been lying to me? Had she seen something in Brandon that I had missed? Or was this something that had developed recently, some conflict or situation I knew nothing about? I pressed call before I could overthink it further. The phone rang 3 times before Brandon answered. "Hey babe. You on your way home? I was thinking we could order Thai food tonight." His voice sounded completely normal. Relaxed, affectionate, with no hint of stress or guilt or the emotional state of someone who had just tried to kill his sister-in-law. Either he was an incredible actor, or Vanessa had been wrong about who attacked her. Or maybe she had been so disoriented from her injuries that she didn't know what she was saying. "Brandon, something happened. I'm at the hospital." His tone shifted immediately to concern. "Are you okay? What's wrong?" "It's Vanessa. I found her on Pinecrest Road. Someone attacked her. She's in surgery now." There was a pause, just a fraction of a second too long, before he responded. "Oh my God. Is she going to be okay?" "They don't know yet. It's bad, Brandon. Really bad. I'm coming to the hospital right now." "Which entrance should I use?" "The emergency department." "But you don't have to come. There's nothing to do right now except wait." "Of course I'm coming. You shouldn't be alone right now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up, and I sat there staring at my phone, trying to analyze that brief pause before he responded. Had it been the natural hesitation of someone processing shocking news, or had it been the calculation of someone trying to figure out how much I knew? Was I being paranoid, or was my instinct trying to tell me something my conscious mind didn't want to accept? 20 minutes gave me time to think, to plan, to decide how I was going to handle this. If Brandon was innocent, then I was about to treat my husband like a suspect in a crime he didn't commit, potentially damaging our marriage based on words my injured sister might not have even meant the way I interpreted them. But if he was guilty, then I needed to be smart about this. I needed to keep him from knowing what Vanessa had said while I figured out how to prove it and how to make sure he never got the chance to finish what he started. I washed Vanessa's blood off my hands in the bathroom, watching the water turn pink as it spiraled down the drain. My reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger. Same face, same dark hair pulled back in the ponytail I always wore for work, same green eyes. But something fundamental had changed in the last hour. I had left home this morning as Nicole Caldwell, a woman who thought she understood her life and the people in it. I was standing here now as someone who didn't know what was real anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Melissa, my best friend since high school. We had plans to meet for coffee tomorrow morning, but I had completely forgotten about them until I saw her name on my screen. Still on for coffee tomorrow? I have some news to share. I typed back quickly. Emergency with Vanessa. We'll explain later. Can I come to your place tonight instead of going home? Her response was immediate. Of course. What happened? Are you okay? We'll tell you everything when I get there. Might be late. Door will be unlocked. Let yourself in. Having a plan, even a small one, made me feel slightly more in control. I would wait at the hospital until Vanessa was out of surgery and stable enough that leaving wouldn't feel like abandonment. I would interact with Brandon and watch him carefully for any signs of guilt or deception. And then I would go to Melissa's apartment instead of going home, buying myself time to think without having to pretend everything was normal while sleeping next to someone who might have just tried to kill my sister. The door to the consultation room opened, and Brandon stepped inside. He was still wearing his work clothes, a charcoal suit with the tie loosened and the top button of his shirt undone. His dark hair was slightly messy, like he had been running his hands through it during the drive over. He looked genuinely worried, his blue eyes scanning my face with concern that seemed completely authentic. He crossed the room and pulled me into a hug, and I let him because I needed to feel his reaction, to see if there was any stiffness or hesitation in the way he held me. But he felt exactly the way he always felt, warm and solid and familiar. His cologne was the same one he had been wearing since before we got married. His heartbeat was steady against my cheek. Nothing about him suggested guilt or fear or the adrenaline aftermath of violence. Tell me what happened, he said quietly. So I did, describing everything from the moment I saw something in the ditch to finding Vanessa to calling 911 to following the ambulance here. I left out the part about what she had whispered to me, watching Brandon's face carefully for any reaction that might give him away. But he just listened with the same horrified attention anyone would have, asking appropriate questions and making appropriate comments about how terrible this was and how glad he was that I had found her in time. Have the police said anything about who might have done this? He asked. Not yet. They're treating it as an assault investigation. A detective is supposed to come talk to me and to Vanessa once she's stable enough. Brandon nodded, his arms still around my shoulders. Do they think it was random, or did someone target her specifically? The question felt loaded somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. I don't know. They haven't told me much yet. We sat together in that small room for the next 3 hours while Vanessa was in surgery. Brandon went to get us coffee from the cafeteria. He made small talk with the nurses who passed by, thanking them for taking care of my sister. He held my hand and rubbed my back and did all the things a supportive husband would do. And with every passing minute, I felt more confused about whether I was being paranoid or whether I was watching a performance from someone who had practiced being trustworthy so many times that it looked indistinguishable from the real thing. Dr. Kim finally emerged from the surgical suite around midnight, still in her scrubs with her surgical cap pulled down around her neck. She looked exhausted but not defeated, which I took as a positive sign. The surgery went as well as we could have hoped. We were able to repair the internal bleeding and stabilize her fractures. She's being moved to the ICU now. The next 24 to 48 hours will tell us more about her neurological status and her overall prognosis. Can I see her? Once she's settled in the ICU, yes. But Nicole, she's not conscious yet, and we have her heavily sedated to give her body time to heal. It may be a while before she wakes up. I nodded, understanding what Dr. Kim was really telling me. Vanessa might not wake up at all. Or she might wake up as someone fundamentally different than the sister I had known for 31 years. Brain injuries were unpredictable that way. Brandon drove me to the ICU floor and waited while I went in to see Vanessa. She looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, connected to machines that monitored every function and beeped with reassuring regularity. Her face was swollen and bruised, barely recognizable. Her right arm was in a cast from her shoulder to her wrist. Bandages covered most of her torso where they had made the surgical incisions. I pulled a chair close to her bed and took her left hand, the one that wasn't broken, and held it gently. I don't know if you can hear me, Nessa, but I need you to know that I believe you. Whatever happened, whoever did this to you, I believe you. And I'm going to figure out the truth. But I need you to fight. I need you to come back so you can tell me everything. Her hand remained still in mine. The machines continued their steady beeping. And somewhere in the building, my husband was waiting to take me home to a house that might not be safe anymore, to a marriage that might have been built on lies I never thought to question. I stayed with Vanessa for another hour before exhaustion and emotional overload finally forced me to admit I needed to leave. Brandon was dozing in the waiting room when I emerged, his head tilted back against the wall. He woke up immediately when he heard my footsteps and stood to meet me. How is she? Stable for now. That's all they can tell me. Let's get you home. You need to rest. This was the moment I had been dreading. I pulled out my phone and pretended to check a message. Actually, Melissa texted earlier. She wants me to come over tonight. I think I need to be with a friend right now, to process all of this. You understand, right? I watched Brandon's face carefully when I said this, looking for any sign of relief that I wouldn't be coming home, any indication that he wanted me away from the house for reasons beyond supporting my emotional needs. But again, his reaction was exactly what it should have been. A flash of disappointment, followed by understanding acceptance. Of course. Whatever you need. Do you want me to drive you there? No, I have my car. You should go home and get some sleep. One of us should be functional tomorrow. He kissed my forehead, the gesture so familiar and affectionate that for a moment I felt a sharp pang of doubt about everything. Maybe Vanessa had been confused. Maybe I was destroying my marriage over a misunderstanding. Maybe the man standing in front of me really was exactly who I thought he was. But then I remembered the blood, the broken bones, the way my sister had used what might have been her last breath to warn me. And I knew I couldn't take the risk of being wrong. I drove to Melissa's apartment in Eastbridge, a neighborhood of converted warehouses and artist lofts that she had moved to last year after her divorce. True to her word, the door was unlocked. I let myself in and found her waiting on the couch with tea already made and a blanket laid out for me. She took one look at my face and opened her arms, and I collapsed into them and cried for the first time since finding Vanessa in that ditch. I cried for my sister's broken body and uncertain future. I cried for the marriage I thought I had that might have been a fiction all along. I cried because the world I had woken up to this morning no longer existed, and I had no idea what would replace it or how I would survive whatever came next. When I finally stopped crying, Melissa handed me the tea and waited patiently for me to be ready to talk. She had always been good at that, at knowing when to push and when to just be present. So I told her everything, from finding Vanessa to what she had whispered to the 3 hours of watching Brandon be exactly the husband I expected him to be. Melissa listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. What are you going to do? I don't know. If I go to the police with what Vanessa said, they'll investigate Brandon. But what if she was wrong? What if her injuries made her confused, and she blamed him for something he didn't do? I'll have destroyed my marriage and his reputation over a mistake. And if she wasn't wrong? Melissa asked quietly. If your husband really did try to murder your sister, what happens if you do nothing? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to fully consider. Because if Brandon had really done this, then he had a reason. And if he had a reason to want Vanessa dead, would that reason disappear just because his first attempt had failed? Or would he try again, as soon as he got the opportunity? I need to know the truth, I said finally. I need to figure out what really happened before I make any decisions about what to do next. And I need to make sure Vanessa is safe while I'm figuring it out. Melissa nodded slowly. Then we start investigating tomorrow. Quietly, carefully, without letting Brandon know what you're doing. We find out what the truth is, and then we decide how to handle it. She made it sound straightforward, like this was just a problem to be solved with logic and planning. But lying in her guest room that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her neighborhood, I knew nothing about this would be straightforward. I was about to start investigating my own husband for attempted murder, looking for evidence that would either clear him or destroy everything I thought my life was. And either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Morning came too early, announced by sunlight streaming through Melissa's guest room window and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. I had barely slept, my mind cycling through possibilities and memories, trying to construct a coherent explanation for what Vanessa had told me. Every time I started to drift off, I would see her face again, bloodied and broken, and hear those words that had fundamentally altered my understanding of reality. Melissa was already dressed when I emerged from the guest room, sitting at her small dining table with her laptop open and a notepad beside her. She looked up when I entered and pushed a mug of coffee across the table toward me. "I've been thinking about this all night," she said without preamble. "If we're going to figure out what happened, we need to approach this systematically. We need to understand the relationship between Brandon and Vanessa, look for any conflicts or interactions that might explain why he would want to hurt her." I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and tried to think back through the years. Brandon and Vanessa had always seemed to get along well. He was pleasant to her at family gatherings, remembered her birthday, asked appropriate questions about her work as a graphic designer. There had never been tension between them that I could recall, never any arguments or uncomfortable moments that stood out in my memory. But now I was questioning everything, wondering if I had been so focused on my own relationship with Brandon that I had missed warning signs in how he interacted with my sister. Had there been looks I didn't notice? Conversations that stopped when I entered the room? Small tensions I had dismissed as meaningless? When was the last time you saw Vanessa and Brandon together? Melissa asked, her pen poised over the notepad. I thought back through the previous weeks. 3 weeks ago, at Sunday dinner at my mother's house. Brandon had a work thing and came late, but Vanessa was there the whole time. They barely talked to each other, actually. She spent most of the evening helping Mom in the kitchen, and Brandon was talking to Uncle Frank about investment strategies. Did that seem unusual to you at the time? No, not really. Vanessa and Brandon have never been particularly close. They're cordial but not friends. I always assumed that was normal. You don't have to be best friends with your sibling's spouse. Melissa made a note. What about before that? Any recent interactions? I scrolled back through my memories, through family holidays and casual get-togethers, trying to identify any moment that might have been significant. The truth was that Brandon and Vanessa rarely spent time together without me present. They existed in separate spheres of my life that only overlapped at planned family events. There was something last month, I said slowly, the memory surfacing with sudden clarity. I came home early from work one day and Vanessa's car was in our driveway. When I walked in, she and Brandon were in the living room, and the atmosphere felt strange. Not hostile exactly, but tense. I asked what was going on, and Vanessa said she had stopped by to borrow a book. Brandon didn't say anything, just went upstairs to his office. Did you ask Vanessa about it later? I tried to. I called her that night and asked if everything was okay, if something had happened with Brandon. She said everything was fine, that she was just stressed about a client deadline and probably came across as cranky. I believed her because I didn't have any reason not to. Melissa's expression was thoughtful. What book did she borrow? The question caught me off guard. I don't remember. I don't even know if she actually took one. Why does that matter? Because if she didn't actually borrow a book, then the whole story was a cover for whatever she was really doing at your house that day. Which means she lied to you, probably to protect you from something she didn't think you were ready to hear. The observation hit me with uncomfortable force. Vanessa and I had always been close, closer than most sisters. We talked several times a week, shared details about our lives, turned to each other for advice and support. The idea that she would lie to me about something significant felt like a betrayal, even though I understood she might have had good reasons. I need to look through her apartment, I said suddenly. If she was hiding something, if she knew something about Brandon that made her afraid, there might be evidence there. Melissa nodded. Do you have a key? Yes. We've had keys to each other's places since she moved to Riverside Heights 4 years ago. For emergencies. Then let's go. But Nicole, you need to be prepared for the possibility that what we find might be worse than what you're imagining right now. We finished our coffee and drove to Vanessa's apartment in Melissa's car, a practical sedan that was less distinctive than my vehicle. I didn't think Brandon would be following me, but paranoia had set in overnight, making me second-guess every decision and see potential threats in ordinary circumstances. Vanessa lived on the 3rd floor of a converted industrial building in the Arts District, a loft space with exposed brick walls and tall windows that let in floods of natural light. Her design work was everywhere, sketches pinned to cork boards, color swatches taped to the walls, half-finished projects scattered across her drafting table. The space felt so distinctly her, so full of her personality and creative energy, that walking into it knowing she was lying unconscious in a hospital bed made my chest tighten with grief. What are we looking for? Melissa asked, standing in the center of the main room and surveying the organized chaos. Anything that connects to Brandon. Emails, texts, documents, photographs. Anything that might explain what happened between them. We started searching methodically, dividing the space between us. I took Vanessa's bedroom while Melissa handled the main living area. Her laptop was sitting on her nightstand, plugged in but powered off. I opened it and was confronted immediately with a password screen. I tried her birthday, our mother's birthday, the name of her childhood dog. Nothing worked. Her phone was missing, probably lost somewhere at the scene where she had been attacked or taken by the police as evidence. Without access to her digital life, we were limited to physical documents and whatever we could piece together from the environment around us. I went through her dresser drawers with the uncomfortable awareness that I was invading her privacy, looking through personal belongings she had never intended for anyone else to see. Clothes, jewelry, old birthday cards, a journal from college that made me pause but ultimately leave closed because reading it felt like a violation too far. The closet yielded more promising results. On the top shelf, behind a stack of sweaters, I found a cardboard box that had been pushed far back into the corner. I pulled it down and opened it on the bed, finding a collection of items that immediately struck me as significant precisely because they seemed designed to be hidden. There were printed emails, dozens of them, organized by date with handwritten notes in the margins. Bank statements that weren't Vanessa's, showing transactions and account balances for accounts I didn't recognize. Photographs printed on regular paper, surveillance-style images of Brandon meeting with people I had never seen before. And a small notebook filled with Vanessa's handwriting, dates and times and locations logged with careful precision. I called Melissa into the bedroom, and we spread the contents of the box across the bed, trying to make sense of what we were looking at. The emails were between Brandon and someone named Trevor Morrison, discussing financial transactions in vague language that suggested they were trying to avoid being explicit about what they were actually doing. References to the arrangement and keeping things quiet and making sure nothing traces back. The bank statements showed regular deposits into an account under Brandon's name, amounts that were substantial but not large enough to trigger automatic reporting requirements. 15,000 here, 12,000 there, 20,000 somewhere else. The deposits came from various sources with names that meant nothing to me. This looks like money laundering, Melissa said quietly, studying one of the statements. Or fraud. Or both. The photographs showed Brandon meeting with Trevor Morrison at various locations around Riverside Heights. Coffee shops, parking garages, a bench in Grandview Park. The images had been taken from a distance with a zoom lens, the kind of surveillance photography that required planning and patience. I picked up the notebook and flipped through pages of Vanessa's meticulous documentation. She had been following Brandon for at least 3 months, tracking his movements, recording his meetings, noting times and locations with the thoroughness of someone building a case. The entries included observations about his behavior, questions she was trying to answer, theories about what he was involved in. One entry from 6 weeks ago made my blood run cold. Nicole suspects nothing. I need to find concrete proof before I tell her. She won't believe me otherwise. She loves him too much to accept the truth without evidence she can't deny. So Vanessa had known. She had known that Brandon was involved in something illegal, something dangerous enough that she felt she needed to investigate it secretly before bringing it to my attention. She had been trying to protect me from the truth while simultaneously gathering the ammunition I would need to accept it. "There's more," Melissa said, holding up a manila folder that had been at the bottom of the box. Inside were printed articles about a woman named Veronica Ashford, society pages showing her at charity events, a LinkedIn profile listing her as Director of Client Relations at Summit Properties, and photographs of Veronica with Brandon, the two of them sitting close together at a restaurant, his hand on her lower back in a gesture that looked far too intimate to be professional. The implications hit me all at once, a cascade of realizations that explained everything and nothing simultaneously. Brandon was having an affair. He was involved in financial crimes with Trevor Morrison. And Vanessa had been investigating all of it, collecting evidence, preparing to tell me something that would destroy my marriage and possibly send my husband to prison. She confronted him, I said, the narrative clicking into place. That day I came home and found them together. She wasn't borrowing a book. She was confronting him about what she had discovered. And instead of confessing or trying to explain, he tried to kill her to keep her quiet. Melissa's face was grim. "We need to take this to the police. Right now. This is evidence of motive, and combined with what Vanessa told you, it should be enough for them to arrest Brandon and start a formal investigation." But I was already thinking ahead, seeing the problems with that approach. If we go to the police now, Brandon will know that we found this evidence. He'll have time to destroy anything else that connects him to the crimes. He'll lawyer up immediately and probably claim that Vanessa fabricated everything because she didn't like him or wanted to break up our marriage. So what do you suggest? I gathered all the documents back into the box, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. We make copies of everything. We find out who Trevor Morrison is and what exactly they're doing. We build an airtight case that Brandon can't talk his way out of. And we make sure that when the police arrest him, they have enough evidence to guarantee he never gets the chance to hurt Vanessa or anyone else again. The plan felt solid, methodical, the kind of strategic thinking that came naturally to me in professional situations but felt foreign when applied to my personal life. But this wasn't personal anymore. This was about justice for my sister and accountability for crimes that had been hidden behind the facade of a normal marriage. We packed up everything from Vanessa's apartment and drove back to Melissa's place, where we spent the next several hours making copies and organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative. I took photographs of every document with my phone, uploaded them to a cloud storage account Brandon had no access to, and created a detailed timeline that connected the financial transactions to Brandon's meetings with Trevor Morrison. My phone rang around noon, and I saw Brandon's name on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, not trusting myself to talk to him without giving away what I had discovered. He called twice more over the next hour, each time leaving messages asking where I was and when I was coming home and whether I had heard any updates from the hospital about Vanessa's condition. The third time he called, I answered, keeping my voice neutral and tired in a way that I hoped masked the fury building underneath. "Hey. Sorry I missed your calls. I was sleeping. Are you still at Melissa's?" His voice carried an edge of something I couldn't quite identify. Concern? Suspicion? Frustration? "Yeah. I'm going to stay here another night, maybe longer. I don't want to be alone right now, and Melissa has been really supportive." There was a pause, longer than the conversation warranted. "I understand that you need support. But Nicole, we should talk. There are things we need to discuss about Vanessa's situation and what happens next." The phrasing felt wrong, too formal, like he was reading from a script he had prepared. "What things?" "Just practical matters. Financial considerations for her medical care, whether we need to contact her employer, logistics about who's going to be at the hospital when. Nothing urgent, but we should probably coordinate. It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of conversation a concerned brother-in-law might want to have. But knowing what I knew now, hearing those words through the filter of understanding that Brandon had tried to murder the person we were discussing, every sentence felt like manipulation designed to draw me back into his orbit where he could control the narrative. "I'll come by the house later this week to pick up some clothes and we can talk then," I said, buying myself time. Right now I just need to focus on being there for Vanessa. "Of course. I'll be here whenever you're ready." After I hung up, Melissa looked at me with raised eyebrows. "He's suspicious." "I know. I need to be more careful. If he figures out that I'm investigating him, he could destroy evidence or disappear or do something even worse than what he's already done." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it cautiously and found a message from Detective Raymond Torres, the investigator Officer Boyd had mentioned would be handling Vanessa's case. "Ms. Harper, this is Detective Torres with Riverside Heights PD. I need to speak with you about your sister's assault. Are you available to meet this afternoon?" I showed the text to Melissa, and we agreed that meeting with the detective was the logical next step. I couldn't tell him everything yet, not until I had a more complete picture of what Brandon and Trevor Morrison were involved in. But I could give him enough information to start looking in the right direction. We arranged to meet at the Copper Mill Cafe, a quiet spot near the police station where we were unlikely to encounter anyone from Brandon's social circle. Detective Torres arrived exactly on time, a man in his mid-40s with graying hair and the kind of attentive expression that suggested he was always listening for details other people missed. He ordered coffee and sat across from me in a corner booth, pulling out a notebook and pen. "First, how is your sister doing?" "She's still in the ICU. Still sedated. The doctors say the next 48 hours are critical." He nodded, making a note. "I've read Officer Boyd's initial report from the scene. You mentioned that Vanessa said your name before losing consciousness. Is there anything else you remember from that moment? Any other words or sounds?" This was the decision point, the moment where I either told him the full truth or continued protecting information that could potentially help the investigation. I thought about the box of evidence currently sitting in Melissa's apartment, about the need to build a complete case before making accusations I couldn't take back. "She was very disoriented," I said carefully. I'm not sure she fully understood what she was saying. Detective Torres watched me with eyes that suggested he knew I was holding something back. "Ms. Harper, I understand this is difficult. But anything your sister said could be crucial to finding out who did this to her. Even fragments that don't seem to make sense could be important." "She said it was someone I know," I said finally, offering a partial truth. "She said my name and then something about someone I know. But like I said, she was barely conscious. I don't know if she was trying to warn me or if she was just confused." The detective wrote this down, underlining something twice. "Did your sister have any enemies that you're aware of? Anyone who might want to hurt her?" "No. Vanessa is one of the kindest people I know. She's a graphic designer, works from home mostly, doesn't have any history of conflicts with anyone." "What about romantic relationships? Current boyfriend, ex who might have been upset?" "She's been single for about a year. Her last relationship ended amicably. She's been focused on her work and hasn't been dating." Detective Torres asked more questions about Vanessa's routine, her friends, her finances, her recent behavior. I answered honestly where I could, redirecting or claiming ignorance where the truth would have required explaining about the evidence we had found. With each question, I felt the weight of what I was withholding, but I kept reminding myself that premature disclosure could jeopardize everything. After 40 minutes, the detective closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. "One more question. Your husband is Brandon Caldwell, correct? He runs an investment firm?" My heart rate spiked, but I kept my expression neutral. "Yes. Caldwell Financial Group." "How would you describe his relationship with your sister?" "Cordial but not particularly close. They see each other at family events." "Why do you ask?" "Standard questions." We always look at family members and close associates in cases like this. I'll probably need to speak with him at some point, just to eliminate him from consideration. The phrasing was careful, designed to sound routine while actually conveying that Brandon was already on the detective's radar. I wondered what Officer Boyd had included in her initial report, what observations she had made at the scene that had prompted this line of inquiry. Of course, I said. Whatever you need to do. After Detective Torres left, Melissa and I sat in the cafe for another hour, drinking coffee that had gone cold and planning our next steps. We needed to find out more about Trevor Morrison and what exactly he and Brandon were doing together. We needed to understand the full scope of the financial crimes so we could anticipate how Brandon might react when he realized we were closing in on the truth. I have a friend who works in forensic accounting, Melissa said. He owes me a favor from when I helped him through his divorce. If I send him the bank statements and transaction records, he might be able to trace where the money is coming from and where it's going. Do you trust him to keep this confidential? Kevin? Absolutely. He's one of the most discreet people I know. And he hates financial fraud with a passion. If Brandon is doing what we think he's doing, Kevin will want to help expose it. We spent the rest of the afternoon at Melissa's apartment, scanning documents and organizing information to send to Kevin. By evening, we had compiled a comprehensive package that laid out everything Vanessa had discovered, supplemented with our own analysis and timeline. Kevin responded within 2 hours, his email brief but promising. This is substantial. Give me 48 hours to run the numbers and trace the accounts. I'll have a full report for you by Friday. Friday was 3 days away. 3 days of pretending I didn't know what I knew, of maintaining the fiction that my marriage was intact while building the case that would destroy it completely. 3 days of visiting Vanessa in the hospital and praying she would wake up and be able to tell her story in her own words. I went to Oakmont Memorial that evening, timing my visit for after regular hours when I was less likely to encounter other family members or friends who would ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. Vanessa looked the same as she had the night before, still swollen and bruised, still connected to machines that breathed for her and monitored her vital signs. I pulled the chair close to her bed and took her hand again, talking to her the way the nurses had told me to do, providing stimulation that might help her brain find its way back to consciousness. I found your evidence, Nessa. The box in your closet with all the documentation about Brandon. I understand now why you were investigating him, and I understand why you didn't tell me sooner. You were trying to protect me, trying to make sure you had proof before you destroyed my world. Her hand remained still in mine, no flutter of recognition, no sign that she heard me. I'm going to finish what you started. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what Brandon did, and I'm going to make sure he pays for it. But I need you to wake up. I need you to tell the police what happened so there's no possibility of him getting away with this. Can you do that for me? Can you fight your way back? The machines beeped their steady rhythm. A nurse came in to check vitals and adjust medication levels. Visiting hours ended, and I had to leave Vanessa alone in that room, unconscious and vulnerable, while the man who had put her there walked free and pretended to be concerned about her recovery. I drove back to Melissa's apartment through streets that felt unfamiliar despite having lived in this city for years. Everything looked the same on the surface, but I was seeing it all differently now, aware of how much could be hidden behind ordinary facades. How many other people were driving home to spouses who weren't who they claimed to be? How many other women were sleeping next to men who were capable of violence when their secrets were threatened? The next morning, I called into work and requested emergency family leave. My supervisor was understanding, approving 2 weeks off immediately with the possibility of extension if needed. It felt strange to have the structure of my normal routine suspended, but I needed the time to focus on what mattered now, to see this through without the distraction of shift schedules and patient care responsibilities. Brandon called 3 more times over the next 2 days. I answered once, kept the conversation brief and focused on updates about Vanessa's condition, and deflected his suggestions that we meet or that I come home. Each conversation felt like walking a tightrope, maintaining enough contact that he didn't become suspicious while keeping enough distance that I didn't have to be in the same room with him and pretend everything was normal. On Thursday afternoon, my mother called. I had been avoiding her since the night of the attack, sending brief texts with medical updates but not calling because I knew her voice would break through my carefully maintained composure and I couldn't afford to fall apart yet. "Nicole, sweetheart, I need you to tell me what's really going on." Her voice was gentle but firm, the tone she had used when I was a teenager trying to hide something from her. I should have known I couldn't fool her with brief texts and vague explanations. "What do you mean, Mom?" "I mean that you're not telling me everything about what happened to Vanessa. I can hear it in your voice when we do talk. And Brandon called me yesterday asking if I knew where you were staying and whether you were okay. He seemed worried, but also something else. Uncomfortable, maybe." The fact that Brandon had called my mother felt significant, another piece of evidence that he was becoming anxious about my absence and trying to locate me through other channels. "I'm staying with Melissa for a few days. I just needed some space to process everything." "Space from what? From the trauma of finding your sister, or from something else?" My mother had always been perceptive, able to read between the lines of what her daughters said and understand what they were actually communicating. I wanted to tell her everything, to share the burden of what I had discovered and feel the relief of not carrying this alone anymore. But telling her would mean putting her in a position where she knew terrible things about her son-in-law and had to decide what to do with that knowledge. "Mom, I promise I'll explain everything soon. But right now I need you to trust me and not push for details I'm not ready to share." "Can you do that?" There was a long pause, and I could almost hear her internal debate about whether to respect my request or exercise her parental authority to demand the truth. Finally, she sighed. "I'll trust you. But Nicole, if you're in any kind of trouble or danger, you tell me immediately. No matter what time, no matter what's happening. You understand?" "I understand. I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart. And I'm praying for Vanessa every moment." After we hung up, I felt the weight of all the relationships that were going to be affected by what I was doing. My mother would have to reconcile the son-in-law she had welcomed into the family with the man who had tried to kill her younger daughter. Uncle Frank and the rest of our extended family would have to process the betrayal and violence that had been hiding in plain sight at every holiday gathering and birthday celebration. Friday morning arrived, and with it came Kevin's report. Melissa and I sat at her dining table with her laptop open between us, reading through pages of forensic analysis that painted a damning picture of what Brandon had been doing. The money flowing through those accounts came from insurance fraud. Brandon and Trevor Morrison had been orchestrating a scheme where they convinced elderly clients to take out life insurance policies with large death benefits, naming Brandon's shell companies as beneficiaries. Then they would arrange accidents or health crises that resulted in the clients' deaths, collecting the insurance payouts and splitting the proceeds. The scheme had been running for at least 2 years, generating millions of dollars in illegal profits. The bank statements Vanessa had found represented only a fraction of the total money they had stolen from insurance companies and the families of their victims. Kevin's report included names of at least 6 clients who had died under suspicious circumstances in the past 18 months. Heart attacks that occurred right after changing their medications. Car accidents with mechanical failures that couldn't be fully explained. Falls in their homes when they were known to be careful and steady. Each death had been investigated and ruled accidental or natural, but the pattern was impossible to ignore when you knew what to look for. "This is serial murder," Melissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Brandon isn't just a white-collar criminal. He's been killing people for money." The realization made my stomach turn. I had been married to this man for 6 years. I had shared a bed with him, made plans for our future, trusted him with every aspect of my life. And all that time, he had been orchestrating deaths, profiting from the grief of families who believed their loved ones had simply been unlucky. Vanessa must have uncovered at least part of this scheme during her investigation. She must have realized the scope of what Brandon was involved in and understood that exposing him meant revealing that he was responsible for multiple deaths. That kind of secret was worth killing to protect, worth attacking his wife's sister and leaving her to die in a ditch on a dark road. "We have to take this to the police now," I said. "This is bigger than just Vanessa's assault. This is evidence of multiple homicides." Melissa nodded, already pulling up Detective Torres's contact information on her phone. But before she could dial, my phone rang with a call from Oakmont Memorial Hospital. "Miss Harper, this is Dr. Kim. Your sister is waking up. I drove to Oakmont Memorial faster than I should have, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Melissa sat beside me, neither of us speaking, both understanding that everything was about to change. If Vanessa could tell us what happened, if she could identify Brandon as her attacker with clarity and certainty, then we would have the final piece we needed to bring this entire conspiracy crashing down around him. The ICU was quiet when we arrived, the controlled chaos of the emergency department replaced by the careful monitoring of critical patients. Dr. Kim met us outside Vanessa's room, her expression cautiously optimistic. She's conscious but disoriented. That's completely normal given the extent of her injuries and the time she's been sedated. We've removed the breathing tube, and she's able to speak, though her voice is weak. I need you to understand that her memories of the attack may be fragmented or unclear. Brain trauma can affect memory formation and recall. Can I see her? Yes, but only for a few minutes. She tires easily, and we don't want to overwhelm her system. Detective Torres is on his way. He asked to be notified immediately when she regained consciousness. I nodded, understanding the implications. Once the detective arrived, Vanessa's statement would become official evidence, recorded and documented for use in court. Whatever she told the police would set the course for everything that followed. Dr. Kim pushed open the door to the ICU room, and I stepped inside with Melissa following close behind. Vanessa's eyes were open, tracking movement with the slow deliberation of someone whose brain was still finding its way back to full function. The swelling in her face had decreased enough that I could see her features more clearly, though the bruising had darkened to deep purple and black. Nessa, I said softly, moving to her bedside. It's Nicole. I'm here. Her eyes found mine, and I saw recognition flicker across her face. Her lips moved, and a sound came out that might have been my name, rough and barely audible. Don't try to talk too much. You're in the hospital. You're safe now. But Vanessa was already trying to speak, struggling to form words around the damage to her mouth and throat. I leaned closer, my ear near her lips, the same position I had been in when she first whispered her accusation in the ditch. Brandon, she managed, the single word carrying more weight than entire conversations. The building was old, with exposed brick and uneven floors, the kind of place that had character instead of polish. He met me at the door in jeans and a faded Soundgarden t-shirt, his gray hair sticking up at odd angles like he'd been running his hands through it. Come in, he said, stepping aside. You look like hell. I feel worse than that, I admitted, walking into the warmth of his living room. Books lined every wall, stacked on shelves and piled on tables, a chaotic collection that somehow felt more honest than my mother's carefully curated interior design. He gestured toward the worn leather couch, and I collapsed onto it, suddenly aware of how exhausted I was. Paul disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 mugs of tea, setting one in front of me before settling into the armchair across from the coffee table. Start from the beginning. What exactly did they say? I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my fingers. They know about Connect Wave. They know about the acquisition. And they're planning to file some kind of claim saying they contributed to the company because I lived at home for a few years and used their insurance. Paul's expression darkened. That's absurd. You moved out when you were 23. You've been supporting yourself for 4 years. They have documentation, I said. Financial records showing they helped me. I'm sure they've been building a case since the moment they found out. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. How much do they actually know about the company? I'm not sure. Enough to know the valuation, enough to know about the acquisition timeline. They didn't mention specific terms or buyers, so maybe they don't have everything yet. Paul nodded slowly. When did you incorporate? 4 years ago. October 2020. I filed all the paperwork myself, registered it in Washington State. My name is the only one on any official documents. And you've been funding it how? Initially from savings and some freelance contracts. Then angel investors in year 2. Series of funding 18 months ago. Everything's been clean and legal, documented through proper channels. They weren't involved in any of it. Then they don't have a case, Paul said firmly. Family contribution requires proof of actual contribution. Living under someone's roof as an adult child doesn't give them ownership of your intellectual property. I wanted to believe him, but the look on my mother's face in that meeting room kept replaying in my mind. She'd been too confident, too certain. They wouldn't be threatening legal action if they didn't think they had something. There's more, I said quietly. I think they're planning to go public before the acquisition announcement. To get ahead of the story and frame themselves as supportive family members who helped me succeed. Paul's jaw tightened. Of course they are. Valerie's been managing her image for 40 years. She's not about to let her dropout daughter become a billionaire without getting her name attached to it. The word billionaire sounded strange and surreal. I'd been so focused on building the platform, on solving technical problems and scaling infrastructure, that I'd barely processed what the acquisition actually meant in personal terms. The money felt abstract, numbers on a screen rather than something real. I need to see exactly what they have, I said, setting down my tea. Uncle Paul, when you said my father hired someone to look into my finances, how did you find out? He hesitated, then sighed. Your father's not as subtle as he thinks he is. He called me 2 weeks ago, asking if I knew what you were working on. Said he was concerned because you'd been so secretive. I told him you were an adult and entitled to your privacy, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied with that answer. Did he say anything specific? Not directly. But I know my sister, Diana. Valerie doesn't make moves without gathering intelligence first. If Richard was asking me questions, it meant they'd already started digging and wanted to see if I'd confirm anything. I pulled out my phone and opened my email app, scrolling back through messages from the past few weeks. There had been a few odd inquiries I'd dismissed at the time. My accountant asking if anyone else had requested access to my business records. My bank flagging what they called unusual information requests that didn't come from me. I'd assumed it was routine security checks, but now I wondered if someone had been probing, testing boundaries. They've been investigating for at least 2 weeks, I said, showing Paul the emails. Maybe longer. He read through them, his frown deepening. This is more organized than I thought. They're not just throwing together a desperate lawsuit. They're building a strategy. The realization settled over me like cold water. This wasn't a panicked reaction to unexpected news. This was calculated, methodical, the same way my mother approached her charity galas and social connections. She'd identified an opportunity and mobilized resources to exploit it. I need to get ahead of this, I said, more to myself than to Paul. I need to know exactly what they're planning before they execute it. How are you going to do that? I thought about the family cloud account we'd all shared for years, originally set up to coordinate schedules and share photos. My parents weren't particularly tech-savvy despite my mother's attempts to appear modern and connected. They stored everything digitally now, convinced it was more secure than paper files, not realizing that digital security was only as strong as the passwords protecting it. I still have access to their shared drive, I said slowly. They never removed me when I moved out. Paul raised an eyebrows. You're thinking about looking through their files? I'm thinking about protecting myself. If they have documentation they're planning to use against me, I need to know what it says. That's legally murky territory, Diana. So is threatening to sue your own daughter for building a successful company, I shot back. I'm not going to sit here and wait for them to blindside me again. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. All right. But be smart about it. Don't access anything from your personal devices. Over the next several days, I developed a routine that helped me maintain some semblance of control. Mornings were spent at the hospital with Vanessa, who was growing stronger each day and beginning physical therapy to recover from her injuries. Afternoons were dedicated to meetings with lawyers, police interviews, and coordinating with the various agencies investigating Brandon's crimes. Evenings I spent at Melissa's apartment, reviewing documents and preparing for the legal battles ahead. My mother came to visit on the 3rd day after Brandon's arrest, appearing at Melissa's door with food and concern etched deeply into her features. She had aged visibly in the days since learning what Brandon had done, the shock and betrayal taking a physical toll. "I keep replaying every interaction I had with him," she said as we sat together on Melissa's couch. "Every holiday dinner, every birthday party, every casual conversation. I welcomed him into our family. I trusted him with my daughter. And all that time he was capable of this. You couldn't have known, Mom. None of us could have. He was very good at appearing normal. But Vanessa knew. Vanessa figured it out." The guilt in her voice was palpable. Like me, my mother was questioning every decision and interaction, wondering what signs she had missed and whether she could have prevented any of this if she had been more observant or suspicious. "Vanessa figured it out because she was looking for something specific," I explained. "She had reasons to be suspicious that the rest of us didn't have. And even then, it took her months of investigation to find proof. This isn't your fault or mine. This is on Brandon and the choices he made." We talked for hours that afternoon, my mother asking questions about the evidence and the investigation and what would happen during the trial. I answered what I could, leaving out the most disturbing details about the murders because I knew those would haunt her in ways that served no purpose. She didn't need to know exactly how the elderly victims had died. It was enough to understand that Brandon had killed them for profit. Before she left, my mother hugged me tightly and whispered something that I would carry with me through everything that followed. "You were strong enough to see the truth and brave enough to act on it. Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become." My father had died when I was 17, too young to have known him as an adult. But I like to think he would have approved of how I had handled this, of my decision to pursue justice even when it meant destroying my own life in the process. A week after Brandon's arrest, I received a call from an attorney named Diana Westbrook, a prosecutor with the district attorney's office who had been assigned to the case. She wanted to meet to discuss my testimony and to prepare me for what the trial process would involve. We met at her office downtown, a professional space filled with law books and case files. Diana was in her late 40s, with sharp eyes that suggested she had seen every manipulation and defense strategy imaginable and knew how to counter them all. "I want to be transparent with you about what's ahead," she said after we had settled into her conference room. "Your husband has hired Marcus Chen, one of the best defense attorneys in the state. Chen's strategy will likely involve attacking the credibility of the evidence, questioning your sister's memory of the attack, and painting Brandon as a successful businessman being targeted by a vindictive wife. But we have documentation. Financial records, witness statements, forensic analysis. How can they argue against that? They'll argue that the financial irregularities were legitimate business practices that are being misinterpreted by people who don't understand investment strategies. They'll claim that Vanessa's identification of Brandon as her attacker is unreliable due to her head injuries. They'll suggest that you discovered the affair with Veronica Ashford and constructed this entire narrative out of jealousy and revenge. The strategy was cynical but effective, I could see that immediately. Brandon would present himself as the victim of a wife who couldn't accept that her marriage had failed and a sister-in-law who had always resented him. The physical evidence and financial documentation would be dismissed as circumstantial or misunderstood. How do we counter that? I asked. By being absolutely unshakable in our presentation of facts. By documenting every transaction and showing the clear pattern of fraud. By having Vanessa testify with clarity and conviction about what Brandon did to her. And by making sure the jury understands that this isn't about a marriage falling apart. This is about a man who killed 9 people for money and tried to kill a 10th to cover up his crimes. Diana walked me through what my testimony would involve, the questions I would be asked on direct examination and the attacks I could expect during cross-examination. She coached me on how to remain calm under pressure, how to answer only what was asked without volunteering additional information, how to maintain credibility even when the defense attorney tried to twist my words. Marcus Chen will try to make you angry or upset on the stand, Diana warned. He'll ask about your marriage, about intimate details of your relationship with Brandon, about whether you're financially motivated to see him convicted. He'll imply that you're lying or exaggerating or seeking revenge. You need to stay composed no matter what he says. I left Diana's office with pages of notes and a growing understanding of how difficult the trial would be. This wasn't just about presenting evidence and letting justice take its course. This was going to be psychological warfare, with Brandon's defense team doing everything possible to discredit me and paint him as an innocent victim of false accusations. That evening, I finally went back to the house I had shared with Brandon. Detective Torres had cleared me to retrieve personal belongings, though the property was still technically part of the crime scene investigation. I brought Melissa with me for support and because I didn't want to be alone in that space with all its memories. Walking through the front door felt surreal, like entering a museum exhibit of my former life. Everything was exactly as I had left it the morning I drove to work and ended up finding Vanessa in a ditch. My coffee mug was still in the sink. Brandon's jacket was hanging by the door. The mail sat unopened on the hall table. I moved through the rooms methodically, packing clothes and personal items into boxes Melissa had brought. I took photographs and documents that belonged to me, books I had bought before the marriage, jewelry that had been gifts from my family rather than from Brandon. I left behind anything that felt too connected to our shared history, not wanting reminders of what I had lost. In Brandon's office, I found evidence that he had been preparing for the possibility of arrest. There was a passport in a drawer that I had never seen before, issued under a different name with Brandon's photograph. Cash, at least $20,000 in bundled bills, hidden in a file cabinet. A plane ticket to the Cayman Islands dated for 3 days after his actual arrest, suggesting he had been planning to flee. I photographed all of it and immediately called Detective Torres, who sent officers to collect the evidence. The fake passport and planned flight would strengthen the prosecution's argument that Brandon was a flight risk who had been actively preparing to escape justice. By the time Melissa and I left the house, it was dark outside. I locked the door behind me and dropped the keys in my purse, knowing I would never come back here as a resident. This chapter of my life was closed, ended not gradually through growing apart but abruptly through criminal acts and betrayal. "How are you holding up?" Melissa asked as we drove back to her apartment. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Some moments I feel strong and clear about what I'm doing. Other moments I feel like I'm falling apart. But I keep thinking about Vanessa and those 9 people who died, and I know I have to see this through regardless of how I feel." The trial was set for 3 months away, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Those 3 months felt simultaneously too long and not nearly long enough. I needed time to heal and process and rebuild some sense of normalcy. But I also wanted this over with, wanted the verdict delivered and justice served so I could finally close the door on this entire nightmare. Vanessa was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks after Brandon's arrest, moving back to her apartment with home health aides to assist during her recovery. Her arm was still in a cast, her mobility limited, but her mind was sharp and her memory of the attack remained clear and detailed. She would make a compelling witness, I knew, someone whose testimony would be difficult for any defense attorney to shake. As I prepared for the trial and worked to rebuild my life, I found myself thinking about the woman I had been before finding Vanessa in that ditch. She seemed like a stranger now, someone naive and trusting who believed the surface presentation of her life without questioning what might lie underneath. I couldn't go back to being that person even if I wanted to. The knowledge of what people were capable of how thoroughly someone could hide their true nature, had changed me fundamentally. But perhaps that change wasn't entirely negative. Perhaps there was strength in knowing the truth, in facing reality without the comfort of denial. Perhaps rebuilding from this position of hard-won wisdom would result in something more authentic and resilient than what I had before. 3 months would tell whether justice would be served and whether the legal system would hold Brandon accountable for what he had done. Until then, all I could do was prepare, gather strength, and make sure I was ready to tell the truth clearly and convincingly when my moment came to testify. The courthouse was a massive structure of limestone and glass that dominated an entire city block in downtown Riverside Heights. I arrived 45 minutes before the trial was scheduled to begin, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that Diana had helped me select. Professional without being flashy, authoritative without appearing aggressive. Every detail mattered when you were about to testify against your own husband in a case that had captured national media attention. Security lines stretched through the lobby, a mix of reporters, curious citizens, and people with actual business before the court. Melissa walked beside me, her presence a silent anchor keeping me grounded as camera flashes erupted around us. I kept my eyes forward, remembering Diana's coaching about maintaining composure even when the scrutiny felt overwhelming. The courtroom assigned to the trial was on the 4th floor, a solemn space with dark wood paneling and rows of benches that were already filling with spectators. Diana met me in the hallway outside, briefcase in hand, her expression calm but focused. Brandon arrived 30 minutes ago with his legal team. Marcus Chen brought 2 associates and a jury consultant. They're taking this seriously, which means we need to be absolutely precise in how we present our case. Is Vanessa here yet? I asked, scanning the hallway for my sister. She's in a witness room with a victim advocate. We'll bring her in when it's time for her testimony. How are you feeling? Terrified, I admitted. But ready. Diana squeezed my shoulder once, a brief gesture of solidarity. Remember everything we practiced. Answer only what's asked. Don't volunteer information. If Chin tries to rattle you, take a breath before responding. The jury will be watching your demeanor as closely as they listen to your words. The bailiff called us into the courtroom, and I took my seat in the gallery behind the prosecution table. From this position, I had a clear view of the defense table where Brandon sat between Marcus Chen and one of his associates. He wore a navy suit that I recognized, one I had helped him select for a client presentation 2 years ago. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture confident. He looked exactly like the successful businessman he had always presented himself as, not like someone accused of 9 murders and 1 attempted murder. Our eyes met across the courtroom, just for a moment. I had wondered what I would feel when I saw him again after everything that had happened. Anger? Grief? Betrayal? What I actually felt was a cold detachment, like looking at someone I used to know a very long time ago but who had become fundamentally unrecognizable. Judge Elizabeth Morrison entered, and everyone rose. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for running a tight courtroom. Diana had been pleased when we drew Morrison for the trial, saying she was fair but had no patience for defense tactics designed to confuse rather than illuminate. Jury selection had taken 3 days, resulting in a panel of 7 women and 5 men ranging in age from mid-20s to late 60s. Diana had explained her strategy during selection, looking for people who understood financial complexity but weren't so sophisticated that they would be sympathetic to Brandon's world of investment banking and wealth management. Opening statements began with Diana laying out the prosecution's case in methodical detail. She described each of the 9 elderly victims, showing photographs of them in life, explaining their relationships with Brandon and how he had gained their trust. She walked the jury through the insurance policies, the suspicious deaths, the money trail that connected everything. Finally, she described Vanessa's investigation and the attack that was meant to silence her permanently. The evidence will show that Brandon Caldwell is not the successful businessman his appearance suggests, Diana said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. He is a calculating predator who identified vulnerable elderly people, manipulated them into making him the beneficiary of life insurance policies, and then orchestrated their deaths to collect the payouts. And when his sister-in-law discovered what he was doing, he attempted to murder her to protect his crimes. Marcus Chen's opening statement presented a completely different narrative. According to the defense, Brandon was a legitimate investment advisor who had done nothing more than help elderly clients with estate planning. The insurance policies were proper financial instruments, and the deaths were unfortunate but entirely natural. As for Vanessa's attack, Chen suggested that she had been targeted by someone else entirely, someone connected to her graphic design work or perhaps a random assault that she had misremembered in her confused state due to head trauma. The prosecution wants you to believe that a man with no history of violence, a man who has built a successful career helping people manage their finances, suddenly became a serial killer, Chen said, his tone suggesting the absurdity of the claim. But where is the physical evidence? Where are the witnesses who saw him commit these alleged murders? What you'll see is a case built entirely on circumstantial financial records and the unreliable testimony of a woman who suffered severe head injuries. The first week of trial was devoted to establishing the financial fraud. Kevin testified as an expert witness, walking the jury through the money trail with charts and documents that showed the pattern clearly. He explained how shell companies were created, how money was moved between accounts to obscure its origins, how the insurance payouts were split between Brandon and Trevor Morrison. Trevor had been arrested 2 days after Brandon and had immediately agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony was damning, describing in detail how the scheme had worked and Brandon's role in planning each death. But Marcus Chin shredded Trevor on cross-examination, pointing out that he had every incentive to lie in order to minimize his own culpability. "You're facing 20 years in prison if convicted," Chin said during his cross-examination. "But the prosecution has offered you a deal. 8 years if you testify against Mr. Caldwell. Isn't it true that you would say anything, blame anyone, to reduce your own sentence?" Trevor squirmed on the stand but stuck to his story. "Brandon planned everything. I just helped execute the plans. But the ideas were all his." "The ideas were all his," Chin repeated skeptically. "How convenient for you." Family members of the 9 victims testified about their loved ones, describing vibrant people who had been in good health before suddenly declining and dying under circumstances that seemed suspicious only in hindsight. An 82-year-old woman who fell downstairs she had navigated safely for 40 years. A 76-year-old man who had a heart attack right after Brandon recommended a change in his medications. Each story was heartbreaking, and I watched the jury absorbing the accumulated weight of these lives that had been cut short for profit. But Chen was effective in cross-examination, pointing out that elderly people do fall, do have heart attacks, do die from natural causes that aren't sinister at all. He suggested that the prosecution was taking tragedies and reinterpreting them as crimes based on nothing more than the fact that Brandon had known the victims and had insurance policies on their lives. "Isn't it true that your mother was 82 years old?" Chin asked one of the family members. "And isn't it true that falls are the leading cause of injury death among people over 80? Isn't it possible, even likely, that this was simply a tragic accident?" The family member, a woman in her 50s with tears streaming down her face, could only say that it hadn't felt like an accident at the time, that something had seemed wrong, but she couldn't articulate exactly what. "I was called to testify on the 8th day of trial. I had been dreading this moment and preparing for it simultaneously, running through Diana's coaching in my mind countless times. As I walked to the witness stand and placed my hand on the Bible to swear the oath, I forced myself to breathe slowly and focus on the task ahead. Diana's direct examination was straightforward, establishing my relationship to Brandon and Vanessa, describing how I had found my sister on Pinecrest Road, explaining what Vanessa had said to me. She asked about the evidence I had found in Vanessa's apartment, walking me through the box of documents and what they revealed. "Can you describe your marriage to Brandon Caldwell?" Diana asked. "I thought we had a good marriage," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion underneath. "We were together for 8 years, married for 6. I trusted him completely. I had no idea he was capable of what he's been accused of." "When did you first begin to suspect that something was wrong?" "When my sister told me with what might have been her dying breath that it was my husband who attacked her. That's when everything started to unravel." Diana showed me documents from the evidence box, asking me to identify them and explain their significance. Financial statements, surveillance photographs, Vanessa's investigation notes. Each item built the case piece by piece, showing that this wasn't a vindictive wife making up allegations but rather someone who had discovered terrible truths and was bringing them to light. Marcus Chen's cross-examination began gently, almost sympathetically, which immediately put me on guard. Diana had warned me that Chen was most dangerous when he seemed kindest. "Mrs. Caldwell, this must be incredibly difficult for you," he began. "Your marriage has ended. Your sister was seriously injured. You're facing financial uncertainty. Would you say you're under a great deal of stress?" "Yes, I'm under stress. But that doesn't change what happened." "Of course not. No one is suggesting it does. But stress can affect how we remember things, how we interpret events. Isn't that true?" "I suppose it can. And you mentioned that when you found your sister, she was barely conscious, severely injured, in shock. Is that accurate?" "Yes. People in that state, people with head trauma and severe injuries, sometimes say things that don't accurately reflect reality. You're a nurse. You've seen this in your professional work, haven't you?" I saw where he was going and tried to head it off. Vanessa was clear about what she said. She identified Brandon as her attacker. But she was also confused, disoriented, in extreme pain. Isn't it possible she was mistaken? No. She was very clear. Chen paused, letting silence fill the courtroom for a moment. Let's talk about the evidence you found in your sister's apartment. You went there without police permission, without a warrant, and removed items that you then took to investigators. Is that correct? I had a key. It's my sister's apartment. I was looking for information about what happened to her. But you didn't just look. You took these items, sorted through them, made copies, and only then brought them to the police. During that time, could you have altered them? Added to them? Created documents that supported the narrative you wanted to tell? Diana objected immediately. Your Honor, there's no evidence of tampering. This is pure speculation. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. Mr. Chen, stick to facts. But the damage was done. Chen had planted the suggestion in the jury's minds that the evidence might not be reliable, that I might have manipulated it to support my accusations. Chen shifted tactics. Mrs. Caldwell, were you aware that your husband was having an affair with Veronica Ashford? The question hit harder than I expected, even though Diana had prepared me for it. I discovered that during my investigation, yes. How did that make you feel? Hurt. Betrayed. Angry? Yes, angry. Angry enough to want revenge? I wanted the truth. That's different from revenge. Is it? Your husband was unfaithful. Your marriage was over. You discovered he had significant assets that you would have to split in a divorce. Wouldn't it be convenient if he was in prison, unable to fight you for property and money? That's not why I came forward. I came forward because my sister nearly died and because 9 people were murdered. Allegedly murdered, Chen corrected. That's what this trial is determining. And isn't it true that if your husband is convicted, you stand to gain control of significant assets that would otherwise be contested in divorce proceedings? Diana objected again, and Judge Morrison sustained it, but Chen had made his point. He was painting me as a woman scorned who had constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory to punish her cheating husband and secure her financial future. The cross-examination continued for 3 hours, Chen probing every aspect of my testimony, questioning my motives, my memory, my interpretation of events. By the time I was finally dismissed from the stand, I was exhausted and shaking, grateful when Melissa met me in the hallway outside the courtroom and guided me to a quiet room where I could recover. You did well, Diana said, following us into the room. Chen tried every trick he had, but you stayed consistent and credible. The jury could see you were telling the truth. But I wasn't sure about that. I had watched their faces during cross-examination, seen some of them nodding at Chen's questions, observed the doubt creeping into their expressions. Chen was very good at what he did, and he had successfully introduced reasonable doubt about my credibility and motivations. Vanessa testified the following day, wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair because her mobility was still limited. She was thinner than before the attack, her face still showing faint bruising even 3 months later. But her voice was strong and clear as she described what Brandon had done to her. He called me and said Nicole was in trouble, Vanessa explained. Said I needed to come help, that his car had broken down on Pinecrest Road. When I got there, he was waiting. I knew immediately something was wrong. The way he looked at me, there was nothing human in his eyes. Just cold calculation. What happened next? Diana asked. I asked where Nicole was. He said she was fine, that this wasn't about her. This was about me interfering in things that weren't my business. Then he grabbed me. I tried to fight, but he was stronger. He kept hitting me, telling me I should have minded my own business. The last thing I remember before waking up in the hospital was him dragging me to the ditch and walking away while I was still conscious. Marcus Chen's cross-examination of Vanessa was brutal. He focused relentlessly on her head injuries, bringing in a medical expert who testified that traumatic brain injuries frequently resulted in false memories and confabulation. He suggested that Vanessa had been confused about who attacked her, that she had blamed Brandon because she knew about his affair and assumed he was responsible for every bad thing that had happened. Isn't it true that you never liked Brandon? Chin asked. That you thought your sister could have done better? I thought he was fine until I discovered he was a murderer, Vanessa shot back, her anger giving her words force. But you can't prove he murdered anyone, can you? You found financial records that you interpreted as suspicious. You followed him and took photographs without his knowledge. You constructed a narrative based on circumstantial evidence and your own suspicions. And when you confronted him about your theories, he defended himself, and somehow that turned into him attacking you? He tried to kill me. Or someone tried to kill you, and in your confused state, you blamed the person you were already suspicious of. Isn't that possible? No. It was Brandon. I know what happened. The trial stretched into its 4th week. Medical examiners testified about the 9 deaths, acknowledging that each one individually could have been natural or accidental, but arguing that the pattern was statistically impossible to explain away as coincidence. Defense experts countered that elderly people die all the time, that trying to find patterns in random events was a form of bias, not evidence. Insurance investigators described how they had missed the fraud, how Brandon and Trevor had been careful to spread the policies across different companies so no single insurer would notice the pattern. Defense attorneys suggested that the investigators were trying to cover their own failures by supporting a prosecution theory that made their oversights look like sophisticated criminal activity rather than simple incompetence. Veronica Ashford testified under subpoena, admitting to the affair but claiming she had known nothing about the insurance fraud or murders. She portrayed herself as another victim of Brandon's deception, a woman who had fallen for a married man not realizing he was also a criminal. Her testimony was self-serving and rehearsed, but Chin used it to argue that Brandon had compartmentalized his life, keeping his romantic relationship separate from any alleged criminal activity. On the 23rd day of trial, both sides rested their cases. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following morning, giving everyone one night to prepare their final appeals to the jury. Diana's closing argument was powerful and methodical. She reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, every financial transaction. She showed the photographs of the 9 victims again, asking the jury to remember that these were real people whose lives had been stolen for profit. She described Vanessa's attack in detail, the premeditation involved, the cold-blooded attempt to silence a witness. Brandon Caldwell is not the successful businessman his attorneys want you to believe, Diana said. He is a man who saw vulnerable elderly people as opportunities for profit. He is a man who planned and executed 9 murders over the course of 2 years. And when his sister-in-law discovered what he was doing, he tried to kill her too. The evidence is overwhelming. The pattern is undeniable. Justice demands that you hold him accountable. Marcus Chen's closing argument was equally compelling, attacking the prosecution's case as built on assumptions and coincidences rather than proof. He argued that the financial records showed legitimate business activities that were being misinterpreted by people with agendas. He pointed to the lack of physical evidence connecting Brandon to any of the deaths. He reminded the jury that Vanessa's identification of her attacker came from someone with severe head trauma whose memory was unreliable. The prosecution wants you to believe in a vast conspiracy involving multiple murders, elaborate financial fraud, and a successful businessman who suddenly became a violent criminal, Chin said. But where is the proof? Not circumstantial evidence that could be interpreted multiple ways. Not the testimony of cooperating witnesses with deals to reduce their own sentences. Not the confused statements of a woman with traumatic brain injuries. I'm talking about actual proof. And the prosecution hasn't provided it because they can't. Because Brandon Caldwell is innocent. Judge Morrison gave the jury their instructions, explaining the legal standards for conviction, the burden of proof, the requirement that guilt be established beyond a reasonable doubt. Then the jury was dismissed to begin deliberations. The waiting was agony. Diana had warned me that deliberations could take hours or days or even weeks in complex cases like this. I spent the time with Melissa and Vanessa, trying to distract myself with movies and books and anything that would keep my mind from cycling endlessly through worst-case scenarios. After 2 days of deliberations, the jury sent a note to Judge Morrison asking to review Kevin's financial testimony and the surveillance photographs Vanessa had taken. Diana interpreted this as positive, suggesting the jury was taking the evidence seriously rather than dismissing it out of hand. On the afternoon of the third day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. We rushed back to the courthouse, joining the crowd of reporters and spectators who had been waiting for this moment. The courtroom filled quickly, tension thick enough to feel physical. Brandon was brought in by the bailiffs, his expression carefully neutral but his hands clasped tightly together in a way that betrayed his nervousness. Our eyes met again, and this time I saw something that might have been fear underneath his composed exterior. The jury filed in, their faces revealing nothing. Judge Morrison asked if they had reached a verdict, and the foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of attempted murder of Vanessa Harper, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty." The words seemed to echo through the courtroom. I felt Melissa's hand grip mine, felt tears starting to form even as I tried to maintain composure. On the charges of first-degree murder and the deaths of Margaret Stevenson, Harold Shinn, Dorothy Williams, Robert Patterson, Eleanor Foster, James Mitchell, Catherine O'Brien, Thomas Burke, and Helen Richardson, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories. Family members of the victims sobbed with relief. Judge Morrison had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. Brandon's face had gone pale, his careful composure finally cracking. Marcus Chen was already standing, asking for polling of the jury, but each member confirmed their verdict individually. There would be appeals, I knew. This was far from over in a legal sense. But in this moment, justice had been served. The jury had seen through the defense tactics and recognized the truth. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Brandon would face life in prison without possibility of parole for the murders, with additional time for the attempted murder of Vanessa. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to hurt anyone else, unable to profit from anyone else's death. Outside the courthouse, Diana held a brief press conference while I stood beside her, answering a few questions from reporters about how I felt and what this verdict meant for our family. I kept my responses short and factual, not wanting to appear vindictive or celebratory even though relief was coursing through me in waves. This was about justice for 9 people who died and 1 who barely survived, I said when asked how I felt. The jury saw the evidence and made the right decision. Now the victims' families can have some closure, and my sister can continue her recovery knowing that her attacker will be held accountable. Vanessa had watched the verdict from the gallery, tears streaming down her face when guilty was announced. We embraced outside the courtroom, neither of us able to speak for several minutes. She had nearly died pursuing the truth, and now that truth had been acknowledged by 12 strangers who had looked at all the evidence and reached the only conclusion that made sense. That evening, my mother hosted a quiet dinner at her home with just immediate family. Uncle Frank was there, along with Vanessa's closest friends and Melissa. We didn't celebrate exactly. The 9 deaths and Vanessa's injuries left no room for celebration. But there was peace in knowing that Brandon would face consequences, that the legal system had worked the way it was supposed to, that truth had prevailed despite expensive lawyers and sophisticated defense strategies. "What happens now?" my mother asked as we sat around her dining table. "Now we move forward," I said. "The divorce will be finalized. I'll rebuild my life. Vanessa will continue recovering. And we'll make sure those 9 victims are remembered for who they were, not just as names in a criminal case." The path ahead was still uncertain, still full of challenges and difficulties I hadn't fully anticipated. But for the first time since finding Vanessa in that ditch, I felt like the worst was behind us. Brandon would be sentenced. The appeals would eventually be exhausted. And I would figure out who I was on the other side of all this, separate from the marriage that had defined my adult life and the trauma that had shattered it. Justice had been served. Now came the harder work of actually healing. 6 months after the verdict, I stood in the doorway of my new office, taking in the space I had built from nothing. Harper Advocacy Services occupied a modest suite on the 3rd floor of a renovated building in the Arts District, 3 blocks from Vanessa's apartment. The walls were painted a warm cream color, and sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked a tree-lined street below. The sign on the door read what I had become, a victim advocate specializing in helping people navigate the aftermath of betrayal by those closest to them. My first clients had come through referrals from Diana Westbrook, people whose family members had been charged with crimes, people who needed help understanding the legal system while processing the emotional devastation of discovering that someone they loved was not who they claimed to be. Vanessa's recovery had been slower than doctors initially hoped, but she had regained most of her mobility and all of her creative drive. She worked from home now, taking on freelance design projects that allowed her to set her own schedule and rest when her body demanded it. We had lunch together twice a week, conversations that ranged from mundane details about work to deeper discussions about trauma and healing and what it meant to rebuild trust after it had been so thoroughly destroyed. My mother had sold the family home where too many memories of Brandon at holiday dinners made the space feel contaminated. She bought a smaller condo closer to both her daughters, creating a fresh start that honored the past without being trapped by it. Uncle Frank had taken early retirement and started volunteering with a financial fraud prevention organization, using his decades of banking experience to help elderly people recognize warning signs of exploitation. The divorce had been finalized 3 months after Brandon's conviction. With him in prison and facing 9 life sentences, the proceedings were straightforward if emotionally exhausting. I kept almost nothing from our shared assets, wanting no reminders of what that money had cost in human lives. The house was sold, the proceeds donated to organizations supporting elderly welfare and financial literacy programs. I started speaking at conferences about recognizing financial exploitation and supporting victims of intimate partner crimes. The audiences were usually professionals, social workers, and attorneys and healthcare providers who needed to understand how sophisticated predators operated and how to help the people they targeted. My talks always included Vanessa's story, with her permission, because it illustrated how someone could be investigating serious crimes while maintaining the appearance of normal family relationships. The speaking engagements led to consulting work, organizations asking me to develop training programs and protocols for identifying and reporting suspected exploitation. I found purpose in turning the worst experience of my life into something that might prevent others from suffering similar betrayals. Each person I helped felt like a small act of redemption, not for Brandon's crimes which could never be redeemed, but for my own failure to see what was happening until it was nearly too late. Melissa had been my constant throughout everything, the friend who showed up without being asked and stayed without needing thanks. She helped me move into my new apartment, a light-filled space with hardwood floors and a balcony where I drank morning coffee while watching the city wake up. She listened when I needed to talk and respected when I needed silence. Her friendship reminded me that not all relationships were built on deception, that trustworthy people did exist even when betrayal made that difficult to believe. Brandon's appeals had been denied at every level. His conviction was solid, the evidence overwhelming, the jury verdict well supported by the record. He would die in prison, and I made peace with the fact that I felt neither satisfaction nor grief about that reality. He had made choices that destroyed lives, and now he faced consequences that matched the severity of those choices. My feelings about it were irrelevant. The 9 families whose loved ones Brandon had murdered became part of an extended network of people connected by shared trauma. We gathered once a year on the anniversary of the verdict, not to celebrate but to remember the people who had been lost and to support each other through the ongoing process of grief. These gatherings were difficult but necessary, acknowledgement that healing was not a destination but an endless journey that required companions along the way. I thought often about the person I had been before finding Vanessa on Pinecrest Road. That woman seemed impossibly naive now, trusting in surface presentations and believing that love meant accepting without questioning. I could not go back to being her, and I did not want to. The knowledge I carried now was heavy, but it was also empowering. I understood that people could hide terrible things behind pleasant facades. I knew that intuition deserved respect even when concrete evidence was lacking. I recognized that protecting yourself was not the same as being cynical, that healthy skepticism could coexist with the capacity to trust selectively and wisely. My life looked nothing like what I had imagined 6 years into my marriage. I was single, living in a different neighborhood, working in a field I had never considered. But I was also stronger, clearer about my values, more deliberate in my choices. I had learned that you could survive the complete destruction of everything you thought was real and build something authentic from the ruins. Vanessa stopped by my office that afternoon, bringing coffee and the easy companionship of someone who had walked through fire beside you. We sat in my small waiting area, talking about her current project and my upcoming speaking engagement, finding comfort in the ordinariness of sister conversation after so much extraordinary trauma. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Investigating Brandon, bringing everything to light? Your life would be so different if you had just accepted what he said and moved on." I considered the question seriously because Vanessa deserved honesty. My life would indeed be different. Easier in some ways. I would still be married, still living in comfortable ignorance, still benefiting from money earned through murder. But I would also be complicit, knowingly or not, in crimes that had stolen 9 lives and nearly taken my sister's. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. The truth matters, even when it destroys everything else. Maybe especially then." Vanessa smiled, the expression still slightly crooked from nerve damage that might never fully heal. "Good answer." We finished our coffee and returned to our separate lives, both of us carrying scars but neither of us broken. Brandon had tried to silence the truth and protect his crimes. Instead, he had created witnesses who would spend the rest of their lives making sure people understood what predators looked like and how they operated. His legacy was not the wealth he had accumulated but the awareness his crimes had generated. I walked Vanessa to her car, then returned to my office where 3 new client files waited for review. People who needed help navigating betrayal, people who needed someone to believe them when authority figures were skeptical, people who needed to know that surviving catastrophic breach of trust was possible. This was what I had built from the wreckage. Not a return to normal, because normal was gone forever. But something better, a life defined by purpose rather than comfort, by truth rather than convenient fiction, by the determination to make sure that what happened to us would help prevent similar destruction for others. The sun was setting when I finally locked my office and headed home, painting the street in shades of orange and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new clients and the ongoing work of healing that never really ended. But tonight, I could rest knowing that justice had been served and that I had found a way to transform tragedy into meaning. Brandon had thought that toast at the celebration dinner would be the final word on my value, my contributions, my worth. Instead, it had been the beginning of discovering who I actually was beneath the identity I had constructed around being his wife. He had tried to erase me and had only succeeded in revealing the strength I never knew I possessed. I had walked away from that dinner with dignity. I had uncovered the truth with precision. I had testified with clarity. And now I was building something that would outlast the marriage, the trial, and the man who had underestimated what happens when you try to destroy someone who refuses to stay broken. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.